DNO applications, G98s, G99s, G100s. What is all this confusing jargon? If you've got questions about G98s, G99s, if you want to know about export limits and how this works alongside your DNO network operator, then this is probably going to be the video for you if you've got some confusion around this subject. Let's go. First of all, what is a DNO and why do you even care about this? I think that's a really good point to make. Well, in the Northwest, we've got a DNO called Electricity Northwest. It's their job and responsibility to be able to maintain the network. So they're responsible for the cable all the way up to your smart meter or energy meter. Now this is where the confusion laps in, because their job is not energy prices, so that's Octopus or EDF's or Eon's job. Their job is network safety. So they're making sure if an overhead power line falls down or if the power itself cuts off to your home, it's their responsibility to keep the network going and keep it in a nice maintained order. So when the network was put together and when your home was first built, permission was sought in order to be able to register you with a system so you can buy electricity in. So how the network sees this is you've got a connection to the grid and you can pull energy in. However, if you've got solar or battery storage, you can now be an energy supplier. Power flows the opposite way down the cable. This is where these G98, G99 and DNO applications come in, because what you've effectively got to do is ask them permission in order to be able to send the power the other way down the cable, and ultimately that's what this G98, G99 DNO permissions is essentially all the same thing, but it's slightly different styles of application depending on the size of system that you've got. I'll try and break down now the different types of application and why these matter. So if you've got an inverter size that's 3.68 kilowatts or smaller, so anywhere from 0 to 3.68, this is what's covered under a G98. The number of solar panels you have doesn't really matter in this scenario. It's all about inverter size because that's the limiting factor. Now a 3.68 kilowatt up to 50, most domestic suppliers can't take a 50, that's small scale commercial, is covered by a G99 application. That's what the network operator wants to know, is the size of the inverter, because that's the theoretical limit flow rate of electricity at any point in time they could receive onto their grid. They're not too concerned with how many kilowatt hours we export over the course of the year. What they care about is, at a point in time, what's the most that this inverter can send out to the grid. Now at this point in time, I just want to manage your expectation. So if we've covered a G98 is, we don't need to apply for permission, we can just crack on, install it and tell them afterwards. There is no expectation, but there can be sometimes a delay in the paperwork afterwards. However, with a G99, we have to get a pre-approval in place. So we write out to the national grid and then we go on hold music. Different network operators work on different timescales. Some are really quick that we deal with, a couple of weeks, but most of them can take up to 45 working days in order to be able to return the application back. We then get an offer letter back that basically says, this is how much we can allow you to be able to export onto the grid. But I'll come back to that in just a second. Some customers go, well, I really want this decent sized system, but I don't really want to wait that long. What are my options basically to get up and running to start off with? You've installed all this kit, but we haven't heard back from the DNO. Well, you can be left with two options. Some DNOs do not allow you to energize at all. They'll turn around and say, yes, you can install it. Nothing's stopping you put the panels up. Nothing's stopping you testing and inspecting the system, but effectively you can't connect it to the grid until we've done our study, until we've given you permission. Other DNOs are a little bit looser. What they'll actually say is, yes, you can energize it, that's no problem whatsoever. And essentially you just have to restrict the export limitation either to 3.68 kilowatts, G98, because we know we can get permission for that, or what they'll say is you need to zero export limit it until a point of where we've given you the actual export limit that you can send out to the grid. Different DNOs are different. It is definitely on a case by case, an individual DNO by DNO, and sometimes individual application by application, because we're on different roads with different transformers, different cabling setups. Most of the time the DNO will say, well, look, you can export down to 0, which means basically use the solar, store it in your battery, or lose it until a point of where we've done this full study and given you permission. And this is happening often because of longer lead times. The other thing that's happening due to lead times is the leeway that DNOs are giving you. We used to be able to negotiate a bit more with the DNOs. So they would come and give a 5 kilowatt export limit, and we would be able to do a bit of horse trading with them and say, can you give us 6? Can you give us 7? But that's happening less and less, and it's becoming a bit more of a binary structure. The one thing that I haven't noticed is DNOs being too draconian with the export limit. I genuinely feel they're giving you what they can, and the majority of export limits tend to be 4 kilowatts or above. Some of them actually, a good percentage, probably 50% plus, are actually giving us full export essentially on it, where they're not really restricting us at all. Again, it's subjective, case by case. As time goes on, as we have more solar on the grid, as more people adopt solar on your street, you may well see, and again, subjective with caveats, the export limits start to decrease on that road. The good thing is, once you've got an export agreed, a little bit like your import cable, once you've got an export agreed, that doesn't change. That's not renegotiated in any way. Effectively, if you get a 5 kilowatt export limit, you've either got that, or if you want to add more panels later, you could get that or above effectively. Something to note is export limits are very much out of our control as installers. There's lots of things we can control: system setup, layout, size, panels, but the one thing we can't really control is the export. It is down to your network operator. And it's important to note the fact that these export limits are not us trying to penalise you in any way or make our life easy. It's effectively the DNO saying, look, this is all we can have. So it's really bound by what the DNO can do, but don't be too off-put by this. Because if I could give you an analogy here, think of solar generation a little bit like rain falling on your roof. Think of your battery storage a bit like a bucket that we can look to store. Bear in mind, before anything gets restricted, well, first of all, we have the generation and your home gets the opportunity to use it. Your battery has the opportunity to store it. And if we have a low export rate, we've got the ability to divert it to other things, the car, a hot water tank. But if you're restricted, this isn't restricting the amount you can send, it restricts the flow rate. So when someone says, I can only export 5 kilowatts worth of solar, what this means is if I have a 10 kilowatt solar system and 10 kilowatts is generating at full rate, which is very unlikely to happen, then effectively what happens is if your house isn't using energy, if your battery is completely full to the brim, if you've not diverting to anywhere else, then only at that point in time, your flow rate is reduced to 5 kilowatts in terms of its speed going outwards. Now, the majority of times when we look at solar panels, it's a little bit like miles per gallon on a car. We might say it's a 10 kilowatt solar system. That's a bit like saying 50 miles per gallon. The majority of the time, solar systems very rarely perform at their peak anyway. So if I had a 7-8 kilowatt solar system and I had a 5 kilowatt export limit, that's unlikely to do a great deal of harm to your actual wallet at the end of it. Now, this is a question, what does a good export limit look like? I would normally say with this, about 40 to 50% of your overall array size. The idea is to use the majority of it. But if you had a 10 kilowatt array and you had a 5 kilowatt export limit, you're not going to see, real world, you're not going to see a great deal of restriction. So I would be saying 50%, sometimes DNOs will give you slightly less. Now, one of my top tips, if you get a smaller export limit, you could look at reducing a couple of panels on the roof, reducing the size of inverter. We could also look at increasing the size of battery storage, or you might just turn around and say, you know what, if it is a really sunny day, and if I find myself in this position, I'll just plug the car in for a few hours and put it on a 1 kilowatt trickle charge. I may as well use it all up. So don't think of it as too restrictive. If you are quite restricted, there are other options available to us in the design process. And I think I want to kind of come full circle on this really, because a lot of people get really hung up on this export. The holy grail of return on investment for solar systems is not to try and be the next grid supplier. It's to make savings. Like the holy grail of making a saving is wiping out full price electric. So where you're paying that 26, 27, 28 pence day rate or higher, sometimes with EV car charging rates, what we want to do is remove that energy consumption. We don't want to buy it anymore. So in that scenario, the best system setup is where we make the most savings. The export is actually just a little bit of cream off top that often adds a couple of £100 a year reduction. The main saving, the saving that's often in the hundreds, the thousands, is where we actually save on the cost of the actual energy bill itself. So we've gone through the process. What we know is we've got to apply for permission in advance. We then will get an offer letter, and we may well have to do what's called a G100 limit, which is where we limit the export rate going out. But there's also a process afterwards. We then have to write back to the DNO again on this waiting hold music, and again you can be in for another 30 to 45 days afterwards installation, and we eventually have to tell them, we say, look, this is what we've actually installed, thank you very much, we've limited it to the export, we've done all that hard work. At that point in time, different DNOs deal with this differently. You then get a final connection letter that basically says we've done all of our work, we've updated the local network study, so when the next person applies for solar, they know about yours, that's your system registered. What you then do when you're ready for export is get your MCS certificate that will come alongside this handover. You get your G99, this letter or pre-permission, depending on how your network does it, and you upload this then to your energy supplier, so Octopus, EDF, E.ON, British Gas, for example, and register for Smart Export Guarantee. That's the process. There's a bit to it and there's a lot of waiting involved. This waiting isn't on the installer, this is the DNO, it's not anybody holding their heels in any way. Now, sometimes the costs involved. I think it's a fair thing to say that your installer has to fill out this paperwork, and there'll often be a cost associated with it. Us, for example, we indicate this as a separate line on our quote. Others kind of just factor it into the global cost of it. One of the other costs that come up, DNO to DNO specific, is sometimes a network connection charge. Now, these can vary, some from about £300 to about £500, where the actual network operator will say, well, because this system's so big, we've got to do some manual processes with it. It's a bit of a money-making exercise on their part. We wouldn't make any money in this scenario, effectively, where they themselves will charge you to be able to update the single line diagram, do the network feasibility study, which is checking the cable, checking the transformer, make sure it is okay, and registering the system for you. Where you've got G98, very rarely the case that you will be charged. I've not come across a scenario, but G99, in about 25–30% of cases, you are charged this fee. Normally best to go through your installer because they can claim the VAT back because this is 0% VAT rated because it sits alongside your solar system. So there's a bit of a win there to be gained, but there might be an additional fee. You want to check with your installer before you engage with them whether they've included this cost within your quote or whether this is something they would add on and vary later on in the process. If you feel like you have to be an energy expert in order to be able to buy solar and battery storage, something's going wrong. Your installer should really be taking the time to explain an export limit before you start the installation process, as I'm doing today, probably a bit simpler, to be able to explain that to you. They will handle all of the DNO paperwork. You shouldn't have to be dealing with any of this. Most of the time DNOs won't deal with yourselves anyway, to be honest. They'll only deal with qualified electricians, PV installers like myself, where they'll ask technical questions backwards and forwards. So I would say pretty much for all solar installations, it will be your installer's responsibility to take this on, undertake it, and get all the system registered for you. Now, any good installer as well, which is where exports come in, should be designing a system around self-consumption. Where export limits might come in is where you slightly oversize the system on purpose for future usage. That export might be a buying consideration, but for the majority of people, if your solar system, battery storage system has actually been designed with your energy consumption in mind, it's only going to make quite a small difference to your consumption. Your installer should also be managing your expectation in terms of timelines like I've done today, and they should also be able to explain any paperwork and the process without jargon. If you're early in the process, this is probably a good video to save for later on because you're probably going to have to recap over this when it comes to installation time. If you're mid-install and you're kind of going, actually, wait a second, my installer hasn't described this to me, either say, look, I've watched a video, answer these questions, or if they don't know what you're going on about, send them this video and say, hey, look, explain this to me. If you're afterwards and you're getting a little bit frustrated when it comes to DNOs, you're thinking, what is the expectation? I feel your pain at my end too. It can be frustrating as a customer when it comes to DNOs. These are organisations that are unfortunately slow. Just be patient with it, take your time, and if you've got lots of extra solar generation, turn the kettle on, whack the washing machine on, make the most of the generation whilst you've got it, if you're kind of waiting and pending for this G99 to come through. Other than that, I know there's been a lot to go through. Hopefully you understand it a little bit more. If you do have any comments or want to find out a little bit more and you just kind of anything you're unsure of, stick it in the comments below. Other than that, until next time, thank you.